Bank of Canada is under attack from all sides now for the very first time, as they've implemented another large boost in the interest rates that Canadians need to pay, and this affects everyone, especially middle to low income Canadians. Now, whereas the credibility of the Bank of Canada has been questioned previously heavily by the Conservative Party of Canada, now the other left-leaning opposition, well, they're starting to jump on the central bank criticization or critique bandwagon now for the very first time. So in today's video, we're going to go over exactly what happened at the Bank of Canada's press conference that they held today, why both left and right are mad about it, and why the Liberals are defending the move, and we'll even get into what this means specifically for you, especially when it comes to investments in things like crypto, stocks, and real estate. We're going to get into all of that in this video. This is going to be the last video where I'm not at the home studio my last few days of traveling here in beautiful La Paz. I'm feeling better from the operation that I had a few days ago. So let's get right into it, and thanks everyone for tuning in again. So to start, let's get into the impossible situation that the Bank of Canada is currently in and why they're saying things will continue to kind of suck for the next little while for all Canadians. In today's press conference, the governor of the Bank of Canada, Tiff Macklem, said, and I quote, "My message to Canadians is that, look, we know inflation is too high and it's hurting Canadians, but increasing rates is hard for Canadians and there's no easy way out, but we will eventually get out of this tightening period." Now, the reason he's saying there's no real way out of this, or no easy way out of this, is because the Bank of Canada only has one tool to bring down inflation, or really to affect the economy, and that is by manipulating interest rates, right? If they raise interest rates, it makes it far harder for Canadians to afford all kinds of debt-based payments and purchases, and it slows the economy and could even end up winding up increasing unemployment, right? Higher interest rates means businesses can hire less people because it's more expensive for them to borrow money to expand their businesses. And now these things, of course, sound bad, but if they were to stop raising interest rates, this could lead to an increased long-term inflation, also hurting Canadians, especially if what Macklem is calling long-term inflation expectations become entrenched. Now, you're going to often hear the Bank of Canada talk about entrenched inflation expectations. When it comes to inflation, what people think about inflation matters a lot, potentially even more than what inflation really is, right? Because it's kind of like a excuse me, geez. This is the beauty of one takers. You get to see behind the scenes when I choke on my words. Increased inflation for the long term, if people think that's going to happen, it can kind of be a self-fulfilling prophecy, right? Because if you think inflation is going to happen over the long term, you're going to go out and buy more things now because they're going to be cheaper today than they are tomorrow. Now this means more demand now and more increased prices, right? So that's why the Bank of Canada wants to continue to increase interest rates, even though it's painful for Canadians, both in terms of employment and their investments. So you can see why they're kind of in between a rock and a hard place, but they're under even more pressure right now because of the politicians on both sides of the aisle criticizing the Bank of Canada's moves. Now, about a year into the pandemic, the Conservative Party, especially the now leader of the Conservative Party, Pierre Poilievre, began accusing the Bank of Canada of devaluing the Canadian dollar as they ramped up their quantitative easing program. Now, this QE program is kind of like a fancy way, we're not going to get into a lot of detail on how it works, but it's a way that they've added more money into the system by purchasing Government of Canada bonds with things called settlement balances. They've added a lot of liquidity into the financial markets, a lot more dollars in the system, meaning all of the dollars can purchase less because there's more dollars in total, right? And this is what the Conservatives heavily criticized about a year ago, saying, hey, this is going to lead to extremely high inflation over the long term because, of course, your dollar doesn't go as far. That's what inflation is. So the Bank of Canada is used to being criticized by the right, and Pierre Poilievre now is even calling for the governor of the Bank of Canada to be outright fired from his position. But where things have changed over the past week is that this past weekend, Jagmeet Singh of the NDP, the left-leaning party here in Canada, he told CTV News that Governor Tiff Macklem's increases to interest rates are without merit and are actually hurting the most vulnerable Canadians, the most, even more so than wealthy Canadians, and urged the Liberal government to do more to cushion the blow of inflation. Now, he also wrote to Prime Minister Trudeau directly, reminding him that recently the government updated their mandate with the Bank of Canada so that the central bank wouldn't have to only worry about inflation, but that they should also consider stability for the economic system, as well as labor market conditions. Now, this is a change, right? This gives Jagmeet Singh an angle to criticize the Bank of Canada and Trudeau's work with the Bank of Canada, because he's saying, well, the Bank of Canada doesn't have to only worry about inflation and those rates and bringing that back down to the 2% rate that they want it to be at. No, they actually have to consider employment, right? Right now, employment is tight. People are able to get jobs relatively easily because people are looking for more workers, right? There's a shortage of workers. But Jagmeet Singh is saying, hey, if we keep on seeing these interest rate rises, this could mean more unemployment for the most of our vulnerable Canadians, which he's not a fan of. So we've got pressure on the Bank of Canada from the Conservatives, that's usual, but now from the NDPs, this is the first time I've ever seen the NDP criticize the Bank of Canada in their job. But at this point, the Liberal government is defending the actions of the Bank of Canada, with Christopher Friedland saying, and I quote, "Canada is a country of peace, order, and good government, and institutional stability very much includes the independence of the Bank of Canada. Our government respects very much the independence of the Bank of Canada." So what she's hinting at here is that in some senses, it's irresponsible to criticize the Bank of Canada, because if Canadians lose faith in this institution that is the Bank of Canada, that could actually lead us to worse economic outcomes, like continued inflation and wage price spirals, right? If you believe inflation is not going to get better, it could actually make inflation get worse. So if you criticize the Bank of Canada's ability to bring down inflation, that could lead to more inflation. So this is why the Liberals are saying, hey, we trust the Bank of Canada, we need to continue to believe in the Bank of Canada. Now, this brings me to exactly what happened today at the press conference, and it's a rather big deal. The Bank of Canada increased rates another 0.5%, and for normal times, this would be an absolutely huge interest rate increase, but in the context of what's been happening over the past 6 months, maybe 8 months, this is actually a smaller increase than we've seen recently. We saw a full 1% increase about 6 months ago. The last one was 0.75%, and now the increase was only a 0.5%. Again, that would be a huge increase in normal, typical times, but as of the past year, that's actually rather low. And they also confirmed that the Bank of Canada believes now that Canada will enter or is already inside of a recession. They said that we'd have roughly 0% growth for our GDP, our gross domestic product, over the next 3 quarters or 9 months. That's roughly until June 2023. Now, the reason this is so significant is because the traditional definition of a recession is 2 quarters or more of 0% or negative growth for the GDP or growth for the economy. So what the Bank of Canada is saying here is that while they didn't outright say we're in a recession or we're going into a recession, they didn't use those words, but they just described exactly what those words mean, right? So a kind of a subtle way of them saying, yeah, we're going to hit a recession, there's no way around it at this point, or perhaps that we're even in it right now. Now, some will say that the Bank of Canada was influenced by the increased political pressure this time to not raise rates even further, and that they may have actually been considering a higher increase before they were being attacked on all sides, right? We see the Liberals and Conservatives attacking now, so maybe the Bank of Canada said, hey, maybe we won't raise it 0.75% or maybe a full percent to try to bring down inflation. Maybe we should kind of listen to what some of these politicians are now saying. But when he was asked a question during the press conference today that insinuated that he was less independent than he should be, Tiff said independence for the central bank becomes more important when the decisions are difficult, essentially refuting the claim that there was any influence from the Conservatives or NDP in this situation. Now, there's another... Whoa, what is that? Okay. Well, I'm just going to continue here. I think there's been some protests going on in La Paz, but hopefully we get no more of that. Now, going back a left turn here into how this affects Chrystia Freeland and her Liberal government, this is a big deal for her, because if the Bank of Canada is saying that GDP is going to decline or even stay even, well, that means that Chrystia Freeland's going to have a harder time saying that Canada is in a good financial position when she gives her economic update in the next month here. Now, Chrystia Freeland is typically pointed to something called debt to GDP, a ratio that sort of explains how we're doing as a country economically, and she has tied her economic forecasts to this rising or lowering debt to GDP number. Essentially, it's the difference between the amount of debt Canada has relative to the amount of gross domestic product we produce in a year. And if she's saying that as long as we continue growing as an economy, we can actually slightly increase the amount of debt we're in, because as a ratio, we're at a better place, right? But if we don't see the GDP grow, which is what the Bank of Canada is saying will happen now, we're not going to see any more growth, this is going to be hard for Chrystia Freeland to actually make it sound like a good thing in this fall economic update that we're going to see see in the next month here. Now, let's get into how this is going to impact investments like stocks, crypto, and real estate. Now, the old saying is don't fight the Fed. Don't fight the Fed. You might have heard this before, and this refers to the U.S. Central Bank, the Federal Reserve, or the Fed. This saying means that investments tend to go up when the Fed is lowering interest rates, or when a central bank is lowering interest rates, and investments tend to go down when they're raising interest rates. And this applies for the Bank of Canada too. So for those who are trying to time the bottom of the market, maybe don't fight the Fed. You might want to look for when the central bank starts slowing or even stopping interest rate hikes. That's going to be important to look for because that indicates a policy pivot or a change in direction from the central bank. And today even, the Bank of Canada Governor Tiff Macklem said, we're getting close to being out of the interest rate rising period, but we're not quite there yet. Now, this is significant because it's the very first time he's made this kind of statement, even subtly suggesting that there's a pattern to rate hikes now that we're going to see. We saw a 1 point, like a full percentage point increase previously, and then 0.75, and now 0.5, and he's sort of subtly just suggesting here that the next one could be a quarter percentage or 0.25 of an increase, and maybe the next one after that would mean a pause of interest rate hikes. Now that's pretty significant because it means that there's a chance that we're at or even slightly past the bottom now of the markets if you believe in the don't fight the Fed idiom. But the reality is that nobody really knows what's going to happen going forward, so you have to take all of this with a grain of salt. Now, personally, I always recommend not trying to time the bottom of the market, and that instead it's better to dollar cost average into the market over time into assets that fit your risk tolerance, that you are confident in holding for the long term, while at the same time working to increase your disposable income to be able to invest more regularly, more consistently. Now, of course, we talk a lot about that in the Canada Money Mastery program. The link is down in the description there. We talk about how you can get into more detail about how you can get started investing, but also go into more important levers that you can pull to be able to make more money, save more money, and to be able to invest that money by doing things like house hacking or rental hacking, among a number of other things. Now, you can look up all of those terms that I just mentioned there to learn, probably for free on the internet somewhere, but if you're interested in getting them on all in one spot, I've made this course, so you can check that out in the link in the description. And at the same time, if you're looking at investing, you can check out the link in the description for Wealth Simple, where you can get up to $50 when you fund your account for the first time. That's great for buying stocks and index funds, index ETFs that you can hold for the long term. And if you're interested in something that's a little bit more risky, a higher volatility, and you're looking for a longer term play, you could look at getting into crypto, and you can check out the link in the description for Newton. That's one of the exchanges that I prefer to use here in Canada. Again, you can get $25 for funding your account there in the description. But that just about does it for today's video. I'm curious what you think about all of this. Hopefully the sounds around here, the sort of firework that went off as a protest against the Bolivian government didn't sway you from continuing the video. Let me know if you got to this point in the video. Of course, this is going to be my last one on travels, and I'll be back in the studio bringing you all the same kind of updates, but with more detail, not a one-taker. You'll get all those graphs again, but I'm glad I've been able to stay connected with you while I've been away from home for a little bit here. So let me know what you think down in the comments below. I read every single one, and I try to get back to as many as I possibly can. But with all that said, thanks so much for watching, everybody. I really hope this video has helped you out, at least a little bit, and I'll see you next time from Canada, not from Bolivia.